Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we fly unto thee, O Virgin of Virgins, our Mother. Come before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petition, but in thy mercy hear and answer me. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. How many of you found yourself at that moment when you had children and you said, I will not be my father, I will not be my mother, I will not say the things they said, and then you find yourself saying exactly what they said. And it usually works when a child is questioning. And so the 4-year-old boy has an infinite supply of why. He has an infinite supply of why, and at some point, the answer that you never thought you would give is because I said so. How many of us have ever tasted that? At the moment we taste it, we're thinking, okay, how did I get to this point? I think that in that particular moment, we're having an experience in our fallen nature that is not unlike God's relationship with us. We question God. So the talk this morning, the title of the talk this morning is Reconciliation with God. And so we've talked about our Catholic identity. We've talked about a balanced relationship with the triune God. We've talked about some of our practices and dispositions. And so we're going to talk a little bit more this morning specifically about dispositions which open us to grace. We talked about the various types of grace. We talked about grace being the medium of communication between a soul and God. And so each one of us have had in our life at various times another soul with whom we could communicate, often silently. Just there was a conformity of wills. Have you ever noticed that couples that have been married a long time, they can finish each other's sentences. They know what each other's going to do. There's an economy of communication because there is a common consciousness of thought. So it is to achieve that common conscience with God, that commonality that has to precede conformity of will. Otherwise, conformity of will is done out of forced subjugation. And so I think I mentioned earlier on that the terms abandonment, the terms surrender, all of those indicate that there's either an additional resistance or an ongoing resistance. And so they're kind of new to Catholic discussion. St. Ignatius talked about an abandonment, but what he talked about in an abandonment was the ceasing of anything, any operations, abandoning, and he was using it in a very military sense, meaning the cessation of activity inconsistent with God's will. So it has a real important aspect to it is the purity of conformity of will. St. Thomas says that if we're to regain purity in a given area, then all of the activities that are inconsistent with the desired purity must stop. What does that mean? For us, it means that habitual mortal sin or self-justified mortal sin, ongoing mortal sin, has to cease. And so we have to stop those activities that are inconsistent with the will of God before we can begin to fully conform our will to Him. Does that make sense? So think about the person that is courting. This is part of what is happening during the courting period is people begin to stop acting or should begin to stop acting as independent agents outside the vocation of marriage, and then they should start behaving as if they are in spousal union, thinking of the other first, thinking of the integrity of the marriage, thinking of the families. We don't always do that, but that should be that movement. So as we're experiencing an ongoing conversion and an ongoing call to deeper relationship with God, it is a letting go of things. But it's not a, I have to give this up in order to have this relationship with God. If you're thinking like that, then there's going to be an animosity on what you, quote, gave up. If I'm contemplating marriage and I'm thinking, I don't get Thursday night with the boys at the bar anymore, I'm going to give that up for marriage, and then that's going to be something every Thursday night I'm going to be thinking about, well, I could be doing that, then that's a superficial form of obedience. It's not a conformity. It's not a docility. And so reconciliation with God the Father, sustainable reconciliation and being in right relationship with God the Father goes much, much deeper than simply obedience. Obedience is going to be the entry point or the threshold. Does that make sense? So let's talk for just a little bit about those things which are inconsistent. We mentioned it earlier. How many of you have had, at different points in your life, hobbies or activities which consumed a tremendous amount of time and you no longer do them? Yeah. I think that's a common experience for all of us. But almost all of those activities were not directly consistent with our vocation. In other words, they didn't make us grow in vocation. Now I ask the next question. Of the hobbies, how many of those hobbies and activities you did not share with your spouse? So you see the inherent division in the vocation to start with. And so what happens if in that vocation where we're helping each other perfect sacrifice, if I say, you just hang out there on the cross, you're cross for a little bit, I got this other thing I got to do, and I'll get back to you. We grow apart when we pursue activities that are separate. When if you remember the faculties of the human person, all the way down into the appetites and desires, once you have a separation down there with the person that you are involved in vocation with, then if you've got a separation in appetites and desires, you've got a fracture in the one flesh union. Works the same in regard to religious. This is why there are multiple religious orders, each with a different focal point, each with a different charism. So someone has to find one that's compatible with their interior disposition, and then they are able to be in religious life in a continuity, in a conformity, because all the appetites and desires are consistent. Excuse me. So let's talk a little bit more about appetites and desires. And so St. Thomas talks about the appetites or attraction to things, both created goods and creatures. He talks about those attractions having to be in line with an attraction to God. So what happens often, St. Ignatius talks about holy detachment. Do you know that term, holy detachment? It's a very difficult term. What it essentially says is that we can take pleasure in the relationship with with creatures. We can take pleasure in relationship with created goods, provided two things. One, that it's moderated, and two, that it's unconditional. The second one is the part where we have the problem. The unconditional attachment says that God gives, God takes away, blessed be God. Now that's really easy to say until you have a terminally ill grandchild. It's really easy to say until somebody kills a loved one in a traffic accident. It's really easy to say until it smacks you in the nose. So this idea of thanksgiving for whatever we may have, for whatever time we may have, this is what St. Ignatius is talking about, our holy detachment. There are monks who practice this, especially the Carthusians do this, many of the Benedictines do it. And they're doing it, remember, these guys are spiritual warriors, and the sisters do it as well. They're spiritual warriors, so they're taking these activities to an nth level because they are ardently seeking sainthood. How much are we seeking sainthood? Are we seeking sanctity or satisfaction? Most of us are seeking satisfaction. And the battle, St. Pio says, the battle is not unto death. The battle is unto purification. So what are those things of which we must be purified in order to be reconciled with God and to have right relationship with God? And so for people in this particular group, I'm going to say there's probably a majority of parents and a majority of grandparents. I'm a grandparent. It's very, very difficult to maintain holy detachment with regard to those children, those grandchildren. But you have to realize, first of all, they're not our children. I don't have authority over them. And so we often get twisted up, especially about things. Again, we talked about most of our anxiety, angst, consternation is because people do not behave the way we think they should. And so your children are not going to raise, by and large, are not going to raise your grandchildren the way you would. Because they're their children, they're not your children. And so there's ways to do this and get a distance and do this and still be reconciled with God the Father. Because if you don't, what you're going to find is your most contentious moments with God are going to come as a grandparent. And you may even find yourself saying that old prayer, Lord, come stand on my daughter-in-law's neck and convert her. That won't work well. It has to be that conversion, that desire for conversion, that desire for salvation of all souls, yours included. So let me give you a couple of short prayers, because everybody has some family member that is going through some type of crisis. They're away from the faith. There's been an unexpected death of a loved one. There's been some kind of crisis. And so what we don't want to do is say, God didn't intend for you to suffer, or God didn't intend for this, or because God doesn't, that's not the way God functions. God wills. He wills salvation. Now humans will the accidentals, meaning all kinds of things happen to us because of human will, because of other persons, other creatures' free will. God does not stop that. We talked about the three persons of the Trinity. God does not stop that. There's not a person of the Trinity that is the moral police. Christ the Son established the church as a form of governance. That should govern, but there are those who do not subject themselves to his authority. There are those who do subject themselves to his authority, yet do not follow his laws, his precepts. And so we've got to understand that, yeah, what you're seeing is unjust, it's incorrect, it's unjust, it's immoral. But that person has the free will to do that. And if that affects us, that's not God's. Remember, in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, God asked Eve, what is this thing you have done? So God does not act, God does not will inconsistent with his holy will, which is salvation, union, right relationship. So let's look at the case of an untimely death, death of a loved one, death of a young person, death of one that we would challenge. You remember we talked about one of the primary fractures in relationship is why? Not just with God, but if you have a fracture in a relationship with your friend, this person does something, betrays you. You're not going to repair that relationship by asking him, why did you betray me? You ever notice this? relationship is repaired when you say, how can we go forward from here? An infidelity. If there's an infidelity in a marriage, the repair is not done by saying, why were you unfaithful? The repair is, will you be faithful from here on? How do we go from here forward? How do we put this back together? Why is it division? Because oftentimes it's an irrational act. The death of many times the traumatic and unexpected death of a loved one is a result of an irrational act. We talked about a little bit before in a mass murder. We say things like, why did he do it? There is no why. There's no rational response to that. Oftentimes when people betray each other or they say things that hurt each other, there's not a rational why to do that. There's not a rational why for somebody to cross the center strike. There's not a rational why for someone to hurt another human being. Even in self-defense, that's not a rational act because you're acting out of fear. You're not thinking all the way through the ramifications of it. So let's think about that, or let's talk about that and parse that out. And I'll give you a good example of holy detachment and how to apply these principles. So here is the scene. You all are the jury. Here is the scene, but you're a different jury. You're an ecclesial jury. You're an angelic jury. So there's a man who breaks into my home, and he is armed, and I am armed, and he is there to harm my family, and I kill him. Is that murder? No. So I got no's and I got yeses. So remember, you're an ecclesial jury. You're an angelic jury. You're not a Anderson, South Carolina jury. Is that a violation of the fifth commandment? Yes. Every untimely death must be answered for. Every untimely death. Now let's go to a justice application. We talk about the culpability for the untimely death. Am I culpable for his untimely death? To some extent, but not as much as he is. But still, the death must be answered for. The untimely death must be answered for. And so I think if we see these things in this way, we get a bigger view. We get some distance from man's viciousness to man, the cruelty that humans visit upon each other, because it is an aberration of justice. It's a crime, if you will, against God's justice. And so reconciliation with God, you look at the exemplary relationships of people who had relationship with God in an exemplary form. And first and foremost among those is St. Joseph. You remember the term used to describe St. Joseph? He was a just man. To give each their due. And in doing that, each creature his due, and in doing that, you're seeing them as God sees them. And so that brings me to the prayer for those that are away from the church. It's a very simple prayer. It's a very, very short prayer. Lord, let them see themselves as you see them. And then the addendum, and let me see them as you see them. It's a very, very important prayer, because what you're doing is your prayers that are asking God to change or affect their free will, those prayers are not going to be answered in a way that you can see them, because God's not going to do that. He's not going to change their free will. He will, however, through the angelic, prick their conscience, give them a sense of awareness. And so once the conscience is pricked, though, then what do? That's up to them. That's up to them and their free will choice. We talked about, in one of the talks, about the response of many people in habitual mortal sin to confirmation. You remember talking about that? So when you call down the Holy Spirit into a corpus that is involved in habitual mortal sin, you call the Holy Spirit down, and in that moment that person has to make a choice, because there's two competing things interiorly. And that's not going to be sustainable. So they're going to have to go one way or the other. They're going to have to respond to the Holy Spirit in a positive way and crowd out all those things that are inconsistent with the Holy Spirit, or they're going to deny the Holy Spirit, deny the moments of sacramental grace, so that this evil portion is not abraded or aggravated. That make sense? So that's what's happening in a metaphysical sense, is when we choose one way or the other. There's an old Native American story or image that there are two wolves within each of us. The good wolf and the bad wolf, which one do you feed? Because whichever one you feed is going to be the one that's going to be victorious. So the thing is you have to absolutely starve out the bad wolf. There can't be any feeding of that. And so everything has to be to the good. Everything has to inure to the good. So what we've talked about so far is disposition. The other disposition or another aspect of disposition necessary for reconciled relationship with God is, it's not just compatibility of wills, it's compatibility of desires, of emotions, of all of those things has to be compatible with salvation. One of the areas that we really trip up is in being hypercritical. Now this is a difficult concept for us to think about modernly, because we hear oftentimes one of the devil's favorite scriptures is, "Judge not lest you be judged." Are we called to judge? As a matter of fact, we are. And you made multiple judgments this morning. Do I eat this? Do I don't eat this? Do I wear this? Do I not eat and wear that? Part of the rational quality is making judgments. The misuse of the word is the condemnatory aspect, placing ourselves as an ultimate or final judge. But we are called constantly to judge clean from unclean, to objectively say, this is good for me, this is not good for me. This behavior is consistent with Catholic faith, this behavior is not consistent with Catholic faith. For instance, and we know this, the demon wants to muddy the waters here, and there really is no gray area. Gray is the demon's favorite shade. Is the idea or suggestion that there's somehow some vagary, or that there's somehow some difference in a particular scenario that doesn't allow you to apply an acute set of standards to a particular thing. You have the ability to discern clean from unclean. For instance, a politician, so you guys know I'm politically incorrect. So a politician who professes to be Catholic yet promotes abortion. Yesterday there was a Jesuit priest who actually said it's possible for a good Catholic to support a woman's right to abortion. Is that a correct statement? No, it's simply not. Because why is it? Is it an incorrect statement, or is it an untrue statement because we said it is? No. What we're doing is making the observation, objective observation, that statement is incorrect, inconsistent with the Catholic faith, has been practiced for 19, 20 centuries. And so what you're doing is you're making an observation that says that statement is inconsistent. Another one. So it's you'll have a prelate who, or a priest even, who will say it is it's possible that Mary had other children. What are you going to do with that statement? Is that a true statement? No. Why is it not true? Dogma. It's in direct opposition to a declared dogma. So this is not your opinion. And so we need to, if we stay outside of opinion and we stay inside morals, doctrine, dogma. We stay inside our faith and avoid opinion, because that's really not your opinion. That's inconsistent with Catholic faith. Yeah. You see what I mean? This is just a strict observation. Either it is or it isn't. Now, when we get over into speculative theology, for instance, the Catechism teaches in what is doctrine and dogma with regard to the angels stops short of naming and ranking the 9 choirs. It just simply says there are choirs, there's a hierarchy, there's an order. And so if someone says the Catholic Church has defined definitively that there are 9 choirs and this is their names, well, no, they haven't. That's speculative theology. But the 9 choirs, their names are consistent with doctrine and dogma. It's not a departure. Does that make sense? So let me give you another example. Because your Catholic conscience is absolutely necessary for ongoing relationship with God. You know what God wills. We often say, well, I need to discern what God wants from me. Well, we're engaging in an exercise that we don't really need to be engaging in. He does not care if you buy the white Toyota or the blue Toyota. He doesn't care if it's this job or that job. God wills. He wills your salvation. The specifics is what he wills. The accidentals he leaves up to us within our free will. So let's look at another example of where we would have, or we seek the mind of God on particular things. How many of you know about there's thousands of frozen embryos in this country? What is the just response? What should happen to those? So give them a chance to be born. What does that look like? Who carries them?
The source, the women that are the source of the embryos.
It's certainly one thought. It's certainly one comment. But do you see how much your brain hurts thinking about this? Do you feel that this ease in your soul? There's no just response.
There's embryos that are decades old, so
there's no just response.
From others wouldn't even.
And it's not because we can't get to one, it's because there's not going to be one. They're the product of an unjust act. And so there's not a just response. Many times justice cannot be effected because you go down a series of unjust acts. You go down a series of decisions that are made that affect the mystical body of Christ. They affect all of us. But it's to understand that there's going to be, and that's a classic example, there's not a just response to that. Because they're the product of an unjust act. So, what do you do with that? Nothing. Run away. We're incapable of addressing it, so all it's capable of doing is causing dis-ease, consternation. You can pray that it doesn't continue, the practice doesn't continue, that we as a people become convicted. Do you see where I'm going with that? Do you see what I'm talking about with regard to judgment? We're constantly making judgments, yeah.
What if we're involved, or what if we have a friend or a close family or family who is engaged in these kind of things? Are we only allowed to say something if they ask our guidance? If they're not, say, our children, obviously that's different, right? Under our authority, but what's our obligation?
Okay, so she brings up a really, really good question. So if we're looking at natural law authority and how natural law authority works, let's suppose for the sake of this conversation it's your sister who is engaged in a fertility treatments that's going to involve superovulation, multiple. So what is your goal? Anytime anything comes up, what is your goal? Salvation, exactly. Of
The soul, the person, that other person.
yours and hers. Yours and hers. As well as the children and other people that you have an obligation to. So, if she does not ask you, then you have no direct authority. You have no counsel. And so if you proffer an opinion, you can simply say, are you totally sure about the teaching of the Catholic Church on this particular area? And they may well say to you, I don't really care what the Catholic Church teaches. So in that case, you don't have an obligation to be strident, because if they won't place themselves under the authority of the Catholic Church or to listen to what the teaching is, this is where we're really bound up today, is people are debating what is the teaching of the Catholic Church. And there really is not these debatable issues. It's clear. What's happening is prelates, even up at the highest level, are wanting to change the faith. This is part of this synoid process. They're wanting to change the faith. But remember that the test, the ancient test, the age-old test is it consistent with what comes before? So the fact that we've got one pope out of 400 who says that Mary is not the co-redemptrix doesn't matter. She is, whether he says it or not. Because there's an inconsistency, and that's not opinion, that's observation. So these are the type of judgments that we're called to make. Is this clean? Is this unclean? Is this statement consistent with the faith? So the judging not, lest ye be judged, is, let's go back to the sister who is pursuing the in vitro fertilization or whatever it may be. If you condemn her, you make the statement, you're damned to hell because of this activity. Now you've brought judgment on yourself. Now you've brought, because ultimately what's happened metaphysically is your prayers for her salvation are no longer efficacious. Because you've damned her in your mind. And so our prayers, and the merit of our prayers, has everything to do with how we see the soul, what our desire for the soul is. This is having the mind of God.
Carl, yesterday you made a comment, I think it was yesterday, on the Trinity and the proper almost destination for prayers to different persons of the Trinity. Can you expound on that a little bit more?
Yeah. So let's go back to, so today's talk is reconciliation with God. And then God is in the three persons of the Trinity. Pater, Filio, Spiritus. All right, and so God is the Spirit, God is the Son, God is the Father. The Son is not the Father, the Father is not the Spirit, and the Son is not the Spirit. So the good old Athanasian Shield, we look back at it. So the question becomes, let's say in this particular case, let's ferret this one out. Let's walk through it. So you've got a situation where a person is pursuing in vitro fertilization. Are they married? Let's just fill in the gaps. Are they married? Are they married in the Catholic Church? Okay, if they're not married in the Catholic Church, then they're way over here. And so this is a marriage, but it's not a sacrament. So what they're dependent upon is the flow of actual grace, meaning between creature and creator. And they've asked God, maybe, to bless them with a child. And then when God does not grant a child, and they go about it on their own, this is a significant impediment to actual grace. And maybe, as St. Thomas calls, an obex. So again, this is not a judgment, this is just observation of how will grace now get to this family. It's going to be very, very difficult Incidentally,
Just
we've
a-
had multiple, yeah,
Just a specific question on that, because, you know, I do have a son who's married a Hindu woman who converted afterward. But, so, as we were going through this, do you mean a Catholic marriage or a Christian marriage versus, you know, someone who's outside of a Christian baptism?
okay, so by definition, all of the sacraments come through the church. So the only way to receive sacramental grace is to be conformed to the sacraments that which come through the Catholic Church. Again, this is not exclusionary language. It's just simply, if you want to get into this room, you have to come through a door. And so, no matter how much you want to be in this room and how much we want you to be in this room, you have to come through a door. And so, surrounding this is the function of governance. And the concept of sovereignty. Who is sovereign? When we say Jesus is Lord, what we're saying is the totality of Jesus, who he is, what he did, the church's teachings, the Blessed Mother. This is a whole big packet. So, in a marriage or in a relationship whereby you're not under the governance of the church, then de facto there is no sacramental grace. The only sacramental, or the only grace is actual grace. Now let's look at the opportunity or the situation where both of these people are baptized in a Trinitarian form. They had the initial sacrament. So they receive sacramental grace at that moment. This will often serve as the prick of conscience. We've had more than one case, incidentally, in vitro fertilization, multiple superovulation, all of these things which result in embryos and or killed embryos figure in possession cases. Because to interfere with procreation, who are you directly attacking? God the Father, the Creator, the author of life. And so you're seeking to supplant that role. And so when you do that, then some of the higher choirs and more powerful angels, or demons that fell, they're now interested in your activity. They're very, very interested in your activity. And so when that happens, conversion. Let's talk about conversion. So sometimes, and we've had multiple cases, where a child will ask their parents, they'll tell them, well, you know, we couldn't have children, and so we had you, and well, what about the others? When a child recognizes that many others of his siblings have been sacrificed so that he could live, then it's a very eye-opening moment.
Yes, Kyle, I know many Protestant people who have had vasectomies. Could you just speak about that a little bit?
So there's a lot of Catholic people who have had vasectomies. So the general observation is that 100% of the vasectomies are on men. Okay? So from a moral theological standpoint, it is considered self-harm and mutilation. And it's mutilation which impedes the person's ability to procreate. And so it is a mortal sin. It's classified as a mortal sin. And what is encouraged is for it to be repaired, for it to be restored. And so it is one that it's a sin that needs to be confessed. And it's one that, if at all possible, needs to be, the physical restoration needs to be done. So the rejoining of the vas deferens and then the integrity of that particular structure needs to be ensured if possible.
So if people in that situation who are Protestant, because I know many who have had this done, and whether they believe it's a mortal sin or not, it still is a mortal sin. And if it's unconfessed before God,
So let's go to what makes it a mortal sin. What makes it a mortal sin is it's against the natural law to a grave extent, because it negates the body's ability to procreate. Does that make sense?
But then the person has to have full knowledge of the grave extent in order for them to be fully culpable?
No, and so this is something that modernly we get kind of mixed up. So it's grave matter by definition, and so it's one of those things that you don't dabble in it. You don't. It's not by degrees, because self-harm goes to, especially if it changes the use of the body. This is one of the things that really speaks to gender dysphoria and mutilation. Is this is by definition mortal sin. It doesn't require an in-depth knowledge, because it's against the natural law. It's against the preservation of the corpus. It's against that which we should know. You find yourself really having the same argument that says, I didn't know it was wrong to kill somebody. Yeah, at some point in, the natural law says, another area of this in my declaration is divination. Divination is a mortal sin de facto, not by degree, because the prohibition is very clear. Once you know the prohibition, then it's not permissible in any degree. And so the whole concept of self-harm, and we don't hear this anymore. We used to understand what it was for the integrity of the corpus. We really used to understand that. I'll give you a classic example. How many of you in here know for sure, or would agree with the statement, your grandmothers would have never pierced their ears? No, they would have never done that, because it's the integrity of the corpus. Now it's become commonplace. But we used to talk about decorum. We used to talk about integrity of the corpus. We used to talk about what is the purpose. And so another way to look at this, do you know the term off-label use? So off-label use means I'm using something for an activity which it was not designed. We are engaged in a lot of off-label use activities. What is our label? What were we intended for? To know, love, and serve God. And to be joined to Him through vocation, through the sacraments. So any of these things, these activities are off-label uses. So the vasectomy actually becomes a self-harm modification of the body so that it can serve the human, not God. Very simple. And so when you see it that way, what is the motivation for the vasectomy? Is so that I can engage in the conjugal act without the requisite result.
So what about a family, a woman has 5 children, they can't afford it, stress is really bad, and she has a tooth torn. Is that the same thing as a vasectomy?
It is. It is. And so when you talk about changing the reproductive status, let's go back, and you're making an economic case for no more children.
But it's also a psychological case. It's very difficult.
So the correct answer is to stop the conjugal act.
A gift from God.
Say again?
A gift from God. Loving each other.
Well, so are the children a gift from God.
True.
So there's an edge there. Just stop and think about it. In the 30s, up until 1930, every single Christian denomination in this country had a prohibition against abortion and against contraception. Everyone. Now, Catholic Church is the only one that has an official stance on that. And the argument was, because of the Depression, because of things are so bad, you can't bring a child into this world. Nobody said you should stop having sex. Nobody said things are so bad we should stop the conjugal union. So what's missing is moderation and the desire and attraction for creatures and created things. Back to the faculties of the human person and virtue, we've got a crisis in temperance, moderation. We've also got a misuse of the conjugal act where it's used as a form of reconciliation between marrieds, as celebration, all kinds of misuses of the conjugal act. So there's lots of reasons to limit the number of children in a marriage, and there's ways to do that that are consistent with our Catholic faith. But you can't go outside the Catholic faith. The ends cannot justify the means.
So to have a conjugal act to reproduce is okay, but to alter, whether it's a vasectomy or tube tie, to have a conjugal act is not so much.
So the conjugal act it is a great gift from God. It's the first blessing. And so in it, this is why the demon attacks it so much, both within and without, outside of marriage. Even what seems to be good, such as natural family planning, is often an acceptable methodology of contraception or avoiding conception. And so you really have to look at what is the interior. It's not what do I get to do, it's what should I do. And so this disposition, we're back again to conformity of wills. We're back to conformity of wills. And so modernly what's happening, and we see this, is large Catholic families are a very, very central part of our faith. However, not every large Catholic family is a fully functioning faith domestic church unit. Oftentimes it is procreation for the sake of procreation. And so that's something to be talked about. It's something that God's will is not sheer numbers. It's rightly ordered procreation. Does that make sense?
So, I have a lot of friends who are still in childbearing ages, and so we have these conversations. How do we help other women as they're struggling with that discernment? And, you know, with regards to when does natural family planning become simply natural birth control?
So what I'm about to say is going to be, it's going to sound strange at first, so let me go all the way through it. So I'll just be offensive. It's not your place. It's not.
Even they ask,
No, it's not the woman. It's not the woman's place. It is not the woman's place. Whose place is it? The man is the steward of the seed. This is one of the inversions that happens in the fall, is women become the arbiter, the gatekeeper, if you will, of the conjugal act. And that's not the way it was supposed to be. The man is the steward of the seed. The man determines when if he's in a position of purity, if he's in, of course, all of this is broken down. Functionally, it's very broken. Because modernly, not just modernly, but ever since the fall, the woman has controlled the conjugal act. And when it was in fact instituted, it was the man who was to arbitrate, to determine when is the right time. When is the right time to bring forth another child? When is the right time to engage in the conjugal act? Because if he is the priest of his domestic church, he's in charge of liturgy. And it's not that she's not a thinking person and doesn't have anything to do with this. And it's not that she doesn't have any input in this. Also, the question becomes, we just had the reading with Hannah, in the situation where Hannah is his second wife. She has no child. She wants a child. She wants a child. And so the conversation is very, very important. What will you do with this child? It's very clear. She wants to give this child to God. She wants to give this child to God. And it's not an exchange. I'll get him for 3 years and you get him for the rest of his life. That's not it at all. She wants to make good on her vocation of marriage by giving the fruit of that vocation back to God. We've got a serious breakdown in this church where contraception is a norm, and it should not be. And so the number of children is regulated by contraception, not by abstinence or chastity. And so the short answer to your question is to be vibrant in your faith is man and wife should have these conversations on a different level instead of the women deciding when and if children come, and often being overridden by their husband. Also, contraception changes the act. The conjugal act there's a whole build up and there's a bell curve with regard to the conjugal act done correctly. And so there is a hormonal exchange, there's a skin-to-skin exchange, there is a psychological exchange that if you're contracepting, that doesn't happen. So instead of it looking like this, it looks like this, and then this, and then this. And so in the same period of time where one conjugal act serves as the unitive and procreative purpose for the marriage, there will be 3 to 10 unfertile acts. Because we're driven to the act, we're driven to the conjugal union out of love and trying to satisfy this desire for one flesh. But if we're contracepting, all the hormones aren't present, everything's not present, and so the conjugal act takes on a whole different aspect than it does if it's done correctly. Does that make sense? We do it too much, not right.
Kyle, how does this apply to married couples beyond childbearing years?
So married couples beyond childbearing years, the faith talks about the conjugal union as the unitive purpose. So it still serves as the unitive purpose. It still serves as a consummation of the marriage. However, you really have to look at if you're no longer fruitful and you take that out of the equation. Are we doing it for psychological assuagement? Are we looking for affirmation? How are we using the conjugal act? And so many times the conjugal act is done instead of deep conversations, pilgrimages, other things that draw us as souls closer to God. It actually ends up drawing us away. And we become very, very concerned about self-appearance. In that, we can be led astray. We're open to deception because we're concerned about how we appear. Does that make sense? Maybe difficult.
Not totally.
Okay, so you really got to be suspect about what's motivating me to engage in the conjugal act at an age past childbearing. Is that motivation pure?
So then, with contraception, we're consciously taking what was created to be fertile and rendering it sterile.
Correct.
And then that has all kinds of implications.
Correct.
Psychological.
Correct.
Active.
Once you depart the purpose of the act and you continue the act, then the focus becomes on the act itself, not on what should be the result.
The fruit of the act.
Correct. And then that fruit either being children or the unitive consummated purpose.
Can I make an advertisement for NFB?
Yeah.
25 years ago, we had 3 kids already. I think the 4th was on the way, and my wife said she didn't want to do contraception. She never felt comfortable physically either with that. And we happened to be traveling down southward from New Jersey. We were in Charleston, and one of the parishes there was having an NFP class. So I stayed out in the minivan with the kids. She went into the class, and she came out with a plan. And the unadvertised benefits to our marriage of NFP, and I don't hear it ever talked about, but the romance and attraction between the two of us as we both participated in natural family planning. I had to do the tracking every night, so I knew every conception of the couple of kids that followed it, and the miscarriages. I knew the conception of each one of those, but it continues to this day that attraction just got so much more enhanced between us. So the romantic part was the unitive part was such a blessing.
I agree that natural family planning, properly utilized, is extremely beneficial to a marriage. Extremely. But we've got a lot of modern NFP use which is off-label, not what it was designed to do. But it is the right understanding of how that opens you to relationship with God. And it doesn't open, it's not designed to draw the individual closer to God, but the marriage, the one flesh union. That's the vocation union.
I was out for a couple seconds, but have you addressed the purpose of marriage versus the procreative act and children being a fruit of the marriage? And
Not in that way. We've been around it, but I'll go ahead and.
so the two things that you and I have talked about in the past is whether or not you have children does not establish whether your marriage is a good marriage or a bad marriage and those kinds of issues, and then what that looks like in that go forward.
So Kate brings up a good point, so let's go back at it from another way, and that is marriage and religious life, the two vocations, are about spousal union. And spousal union is about total gift of self, without expectation. So when someone says, when a young person says, I want to be married because I want to be a father, I want to be a mother, that's disordered vocation. That's a disordered call. And technically, if a young man says, I want to be a priest, that's a disordered call. The right order is, I want to be a religious. I want to give my life to God. God will determine if I'm to be a father, priest, or father, sire of children. You see the difference? So it has to be a gift. It has to be a total gift of self without expectation. So the right ordered marriage, now this comes back to the sibling who is practicing in vitro, is there's an expectation or an entitlement mentality that says if I'm married, I must have children. And that's not it at all. So what the vocation is spousal union, total gift of self. God determines if you are a father or a mother. In the same, both in religious and in marriage. So to be a father, to be responsible for souls, to gain the priesthood, means that in your formation, someone's going to make the determination if you are to be a priest or if you are to stay as a transitional deacon for a few years and then come to the priesthood, or if you're to stay as a brother. That determination is being made by a superior. You see how the diocesan or secular priesthood totally subverts this process, because everyone who enters either falls out of seminary or becomes a priest. And it's on a very set rote schedule. And so it doesn't give us the opportunity to form the person over a period of time. They either fit into the cookie cutter process or they're kicked out. And so this is one of the reasons we don't have any brothers. We don't have a large population of transitional deacons. Our acolytes are those that are militating toward priesthood. It's a situation too where in marriage we've come to expect children. Even to the point that if we can't have them, we will go offer to raise someone else's children. I'm not saying that's bad. What I'm saying is we've taken providence out of it when we seek to be the author of providence. And so God makes a determination once you choose a spousal path, either religious life or vocation and total gift of self, then God may or may not bless that vocation by placing souls in your care. It doesn't mean that marriage is not a fruitful marriage. It doesn't mean that marriage can't be a font of grace. It's still a sacramental marriage. It's a construct of sacrament through which grace flows. But that language of entitlement is very, very seductive. We really need to listen to that. Another disorder that happens, especially in the West, is once children come along, we no longer identify our primary vocation as spouse. We identify our primary vocation as father or mother. And that's a disorder. We're always, you always order back to what is the primary vocation, and that is spouse. Grace flows through the one flesh union. Grace flows through the sacramental construct, and the sacramental construct is not fatherhood or motherhood. The sacramental construct is spouse, marriage, total gift of self, and then the gift of self is as a gift to God.
So I think also to be clear, when you're saying something's disordered, that means there's a disruption in the flow of grace in your entire arena, right? I mean,
Correct. So she brings up a good point. When I say something is disordered, it doesn't mean it's dysfunctional. How many of you remember the old Rube Goldberg drawings in the cartoons? You remember these? So there'd be a candle and it would burn and it would cut a string and the iron would come down and it would iron a shirt sleeve and the shirt sleeve would curl up and it would do all of these things, machinations, to get to the end point. Those are Rube Goldberg drawings. And so we end up having these Rube Goldberg constructions to convey grace, when grace should be a straight flow right through the church and the sacraments. And so we have all these constructs, all these things, all these relationships that slow down, impede, or actually block grace, when it should be just a straight shot through vocation, through the church, through those constructs of the ecclesial law and the natural law. That's where grace flows.
Can you speak to then what happens in divorce? I mean, we've got, that's a rampant problem, right? And our church hands out annulments, so, like they're chocolate. So, can you speak to that about
Okay, so
that lesson of grace?
if we look at the flow of grace, and we're talking about sacramental grace. So sacramental grace flows directly through the church from God the Father and the sacraments. So, you've got this flow of grace. It all flows through Calvary, and it flows through the governance of the church. What do I mean by governance? What I mean by governance is, are you governed by the principles of Christ, by the principles of our faith? Do you govern, do you live your life by those principles? And if you do not, and if Catholic, Catholic follows most of them but not all of them, then there is a breach in the integrity of the governance. And so the breach in the integrity damages the relationship with the author. So in sacramental grace, we have marriage. Let's just go through this. Marriage is a sacrament. All right? So in this scenario, Catholic marries Catholic. It's not even a mixed marriage. Catholic marries Catholic. They're married 7 years. They got 3 children, and they lose that loving feeling. And so he leaves. She's left with the children, and they divorce. Okay, so what we've talked about, what is this with regard to the flow of grace? What is its effect on the flow of grace? But it doesn't negate it, because they are still married with regards to the sacrament. Now here's a couple of little known things that we don't think about that we really should. Did you know that if you are in a Catholic marriage, if you are in a sacramental marriage, the sacrament of matrimony, you may not separate husband and wife without the permission of the bishop? Who's in charge of the sacraments in this geographical area? The bishop, precisely. So technically, and it's still in canon law, technically, you have to approach the bishop and say, we want to separate. And you have to do it together. Can you imagine this? So we're so far away from the safeguards and the checks and balances. So let's go through this, keep going through this. So we've got a state, we've got a divorce, and what the real effect of divorce is it fractures the one flesh union, and now what's happened to the children is they are hearing two different voices. But almost invariably what they're hearing is the father is telling them how bad the mother is when they're with him, and then vice versa. So the children don't have a chance. Your mother's crazy, your father's worthless. Well, guess what? I'm both of them. So they don't have any place, there's no psychological place. And I will tell you very simply, the idea that children are resilient, children are tough, and divorce doesn't affect children is absolute BS. Once the divorce is a familial spirit, and once it's loose in a family, just watch it. In my particular family, up to my generation, there was no single incident of divorce. None. Among my dad's 7 brothers and sisters, on my mom's family, everywhere all the way back, there was no divorce. There was also no incident of self-harm. There was no aberrant behavior, I guess is what I want to say. Deviant behavior. In my generation of 30-something cousins, there are now more than half of those marriages are divorced. So once it's loose, and then our children are an extremely high percentage because it's an option if things get tough. You never used to hear about a priest leaving the priesthood, very rarely. Now it's happening all over the place because they're coming out of broken homes, divorced homes, that when things get tough, you just shift. You just do what pleases you. You do what motivates you, whether that's rightly ordered or not. So let's go back and parse through this. So if we've got grace coming down here, then the divorce by the living association, by the prayer, by everything else, we've got a diminution in grace. Habitual grace for sure. Everybody's still going to Mass, so we're still getting sacramental grace. So then one decides to get an annulment. What does an annulment do?
Nullifies the marriage. Says it never existed.
Correct. So the declaration of invalidity says now that is no longer a viable construct through which grace can flow. But you still got children. So children and the spouses are no longer the recipients of sacramental grace through the sacrament of marriage. So they're going to be dependent upon the other sacraments for sacramental grace, but the sacramental grace of an intact vocation is not present to them. Then they've got to initiate their own through the church, through their own spousal union. So that once that's opened up, now they're directly back into the flow of sacramental grace. But what happens is, without sacramental grace, habitual grace becomes in very, very short supply. What is that? That's virtue. Virtue makes us act outside of self. Virtue makes us desire the relationship with God in the primacy, rather than the relationship with creatures in the primacy. Does that help?
It does. I guess my only follow-up question is, we have some friends and they have like 11 kids, they're going through this divorce
pray that, again, they see themselves as God sees them. But we're wanting to fix problems that aren't ours to fix. And so what prudence dictates is knowing what to do and when to do it. I have to ensure the integrity of my own house. I have to ensure the integrity of my marriage. And so we really need to focus on what are our own issues. And I'm not saying that to be exclusionary and to shun them. That's not what I'm talking about at all. But what I'm saying is we get caught up in other people's problems to the neglect of our own. And we've got enough of our own issues that we really need to be working on our relationship with God the Father, the reconciliation with God the Father. And so how are we?
Well, you may want to address, when you say it's a familial spirit, that's how the familial spirit gets the home. Because the church is also, the domestic church is a family with the parents is a family as well. And so when that inner dialogue starts happening among households, it starts breaking. That's how the familiar spirit gets loose. Is that correct?
It is correct. And so it is, this is one of the reasons that adultery was a stoning offense, is because the ancients understood that adultery militated directly against the integrity of marriage and the structure, society's structure. And so what happens is once divorce, once infidelity, once adultery is loose in a particular population, it's amazing the havoc that it wreaks, the destruction that it does. How many of you are aware of small towns where this has happened, or pockets of people where this has happened? And so it's a horribly contagious thing, but it's classified from an extraordinary diabolical activity as a familiar spirit. What are some other familiar spirits? Addiction, suicide, divorce, these abandonment, infidelity. These are familiar spirits, and they're called familiar spirits because they're in our families. They live with us hand and hoof, and so we watch how our parents react, how our siblings react, how our grandparents react to certain pressures and anxieties. And so if every time things got tough, granddaddy go get drunk, that becomes an option for me. And the demon whispers in your ear, you're no better than he.
Is that the same as generational spirit?
No.
Oh, that's different.
No. So let's talk about a little bit more about familiar spirit. So the familiar spirit operates from the outside. He's living like it's like he's living with the family. He's a house guest that's subtly there. He's that dinner guest or that house guest at your table that is always pointing out the defects of everyone else to the exclusion of yours. And then he offers a solution. And the solution will be suicide, divorce, altered reality, all of those things. And he speaks an interesting language. He attacks the identity first. You were born into the wrong family, the wrong ethnicity, the wrong time, the wrong gender. These people don't understand you. So he seeks to estrange the family while it's still together. Once you see the behavior, once you see it, then it's easier to recognize it. And so what does it look like? It looks like the teenager beginning to isolate, staying in their room, being totally alone. So who is he talking to? Even if he's with his own thoughts, it's a good chance that this is a familiar spirit giving voice to his dark thoughts. So that's the way a familiar spirit works. Generational spirits. There's two types of generational spirits. One is a spirit that affects the age or the generation. Call it a zeitgeist. So for instance, in the 60s, it was lust. Into the 70s, which was rebellion. Into the 80s, which was greed. So you see various spirits come to the fore for a period of time. And so that's called a zeitgeist or a spirit of the age. That's a form of generational spirit because it affects a generation. We talk about millennials act this way, or Generation X act this way, baby boomers act this way. So these are what you look at. What are the personality traits that are shared, the values and the disorders that are shared by a particular generation. And so that's one form of generational spirit. Another form of generational spirit is a spirit that is affecting a family, a community, or a group across the bloodline or across vows. These are interior. These are extremely, these are possessory in nature. So we're different. The demon operates differently than we do with regard to time and space. You may think, how can he be in multiple individuals? Well, if they're in the same family, if they share the same bloodline, then it's one flesh. And so he can be present to them over multiple generations because he's possessing the bloodline. He's present to, he's got a right to be present to the bloodline, to the descendants, collectively as well as individually. A classic example of this is Freemasonry, where the ancestors make pledges that impede or impinge upon the corpus of their descendants. The language comes straight out of Deuteronomy, God speaking. For those who bless me, I will bless them to the 1,000th generation. For those who curse me, I will curse them to the 3rd and 4th generation. And so what he's talking about there is for those who curse me, those who militate directly against the integrity of the Trinity, Christ the church, which is Freemasonry, militates directly against the church, then there is, in that membership of that secret society, there are pledges made which allow the demon to be present to the flesh of the descendants. How does that happen? Generally, it's an unseen as long as they are headed to hell, as long as they're engaged in sin. But the moment that they start to want to access sacramental grace in any form, to be a priest, to be married in the Catholic Church, they're going to get a little bit of a kick up at communion and confirmation. There's going to be some physical issues. Then the demon is present to exact this affliction. And so whenever we start seeing this, that's the first question that we ask. Is anyone in the house nearing a sacrament? And if so, what is the sacrament? Also, the demon is trying to prevent them being conformed to God through the sacraments. So it's a sacrament and relationship with God through the sacraments that the demon is going to militate directly against. And so if the curse is not affirmed within the 3rd to 4th generation, then it falls away. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that it's replaced with a blessing. It means the demon can no longer be there. But in the United States, the demon is claiming contraception by abortifacient as affirmation, which allows him to remain or be present in the family as long as that is continued to be practiced. It's kind of like drinking out of a fire hose, but that's generational spirits. Okay, questions?
Can I just ask, going back to where there is a divorce, what if there's not a divorce, but the husband has left the family for several years, the grandparents are raising the children with the mother? What is the role of the grandparents as far as the husband being the authority of the household? They're living in the grandparents' household. What, do the grandparents have the authority to discipline the children?
So here's here's the best way to look at it, is you have no ecclesial or divine law authority as a grandparent. You have right to counsel. You don't have the right to command. However, within the household, you have both the obligation and the right to command. Meaning, the person can't live in your household and be engaged in habitual mortal sin. You're the arbiter. You're the head of the domestic church on that. And so, There is authority, but the authority flows through the office of head of household, which is the man. And so that authority flows through him. So you set the rules of the household, essentially. And you can enforce those as long as those children are in your household. You cannot discharge the office of father in his absence. And so it's relegated to head of household, which a lot can be done, but it's a natural law authority construct. It's not an ecclesial construct.
Alright, so not a whole lot of people know this, but my two daughters are actually my granddaughters. My wife's doing a step-granddaughter, so when we married in, her daughter wasn't doing the right thing, the father should have been put down years ago, but hey, that's not for me to say. But anyway, I watched this for about a year or so, going on these kids being mistreated. So I went to a lawyer friend of mine, got custody of the two girls, raised them as my own, never asked them to, but they called me daddy the whole time. So I raised them with my two sons like they were my daughters. So I have no say so as a father, because in the court's eyes, the father has zero visitation. He was not allowed around almost the time he was in jail, so he couldn't be around anyway. But the mother, she was so hit and miss. Bless her heart, she had a bad road. She passed away about 4
So here's some general concepts for us to get through our head. Is just because someone's not discharging the authority of their office does not give us the right to assume it. The demon will take you to the woodshed. And so it has to be done. Remember that they're lawyers from hell. And so the juridical and the legal configurations are extremely important. If you adopt a child, then you have the requisite authority of the father. Because what is the title? What are you given with regard to the state? And so that's what that amounts to. And in those cases, what happens sometimes to cloud things is people will adopt children, and then the children still have contact with the biological father or the biological mother. And there's an inconsistency in what the adoptive father is saying and what the biological father is saying. And so what generally happens is you still have authority, but it may not be perfected in the child because they are giving place to what the biological father is saying. And so they'll use that sometimes as license to disobey you, but it's an interior psychological conflict with the child. It's better, if you're going to adopt, it's better to absolutely sever that relationship.
There was never a relationship. Like I said, he spent most of his time.
Well, when we are adopted into the Catholic faith, when we're adopted by baptism, when we're brought into that, it's better for us to cease any pagan activity because that was our previous heritage, and now to fully live the heritage of the Christian.
Okay, so when you make judgments like, okay, so say someone does mortal sin, you say in your mind immediately, okay, they're damned. Is there any way, when you make that judgment, right, all your prayers, they lose any of their worth? Is there any way to make that right again, so your prayers do have worth?
Yes, and it's a great question. So let me make sure I'm understanding the question. So if we're in a situation where we've got a sibling or we've got somebody that we care about and they're engaged in aberrant behavior that is very obvious as habitual mortal sin, and they have no indication, there's no indication of amendment, there's no indication of change. And so we have to avoid making that condemnatory judgment. And so here's your example, is you remember the story of the prodigal son? So do you think that the father at any point said, I'm giving up on him?
Probably not.
No. In fact, there's a good example of why we know he didn't. So let's remember the story. The boy gets all the gifts of his father, and he leaves. And he wastes them. And he's in the pig pen. So a couple of things happen. One is he comes to a sharp realization, a prick of conscience in the pig pen. And there was no indication that he was going to change. I mean, tanked. He was at a point of depravity. But it says, and he came to his senses. Immediately what he did was he said, I have sinned against heaven and against my Father. So there's that prick of conscience. That's what we're looking for. Why do you suppose he had that prick of conscience?
Probably because he was pigpen in the lowest place of the whole town.
That's the circumstances, but what is the cosmic movement? What is the cosmic agent that would cause that prick of conscience? Prayers of the Father. Lord, let him see himself as you see him. Lord, let him see himself as you see him. Now the Father, let's talk a little bit about the requisite faith of the Father. The Father hadn't had condemnatory judgment on this kid, even though he had gone over a year. How do we know that? So, do you remember that part? Incidentally, if you ever make a play out of this, the part that I want to play in the prodigal son is the servant who gets to go to the older son and goes, he's back. That's the part I want. But if you remember, it says the father ordered the fatted calf to be killed. So think about that. A fatted calf, that's not something you keep on hand. A fatted calf, a steer at the apex of banquet slaughter, takes about a year and a half on feed. And so, when do you think he started feeding him? The day he left. And you can almost see the old man go down to the pen and talk to the calf about, yeah, we're going to eat you when he comes back. He's coming back. And so he's got a fatted calf. There's demonstrative faith. And so the father, though he's overjoyed to see him, he's not beyond belief. And so I think that that's the classic answer, is to go back into that parable and say we have to keep the expectant faith of the father of the prodigal. That at some point their conscience will be pricked. So we continue to call down God's grace. We continue to call down guardian angels. After all, at one point in time, this boy and his father were reconciled. Does that help?
Yeah,
Good.
He fed that calf every day.
Yeah. Every day.
So another thing that you pointed out to me is when he quit sleeping with pigs, it wasn't like he was instantly home.
Right.
He had a journey back.
Yeah.
And so that
There's a journey.
Isn't instantaneous in a temporal sense. He had a journey back to his father.
Correct. And so, don't get caught up on behavior. Don't get caught up on behavior. We want to affect people's behavior versus their eternal disposition, and it should be the other way around. We want to be focused on salvation of souls, whatever path that may take. And we really limit the efficacy of our prayer when we have a negative opinion or a limit on what God can do within to the individual.
If you're gonna talk about this, then you don't have to answer the question, but is there a way to streamline our prayer to make it more efficacious?
Yeah, there definitely is. And so when we talked about prayer the other day, there's prayers, first and foremost is the prayers of thanksgiving. If you focus on prayers of thanksgiving, giving thanks to God for every single thing and every single opportunity, you find that a lot of it falls away. And if we lose the critical nature, it's surprising how much of our prayer is some form of critique, where we want things to be a different way or to conform to a vision that we have. When the focus of our prayers needs to be thanksgiving and conformity of our will to God, to want what He wants because He wants it. I think it really does help streamline our prayer. Prayers of intercession and prayers of petition should be a minimal part of what our prayer is. The rest of our prayer should be that communication with God, that intimacy with God. When you're with your spouse, What do you talk about? What do you think about? A lot of our relationship with God tends to be administrative, like our relationship with our spouses. Is we spend a lot of time talking amongst husbands and wives, just the administration of being married. But you got to get beyond that and say, what is the fruit of marriage? What is the fruit of spousal union? What is the commonality of vision?
In addressing hobbies at the beginning of your presentation, I sewed and made crafts. My husband has absolutely no interest in that. I could not share that with him. And some of it was to sell to help, so I didn't have to go to work. I got from you that it was implied that your hobbies should be together. And there was no way that that was going to happen. And I loved sewing and making crafts. So how do you take that away or justify why?
Well, so what you're looking at is, remember that in these presentations we're talking about what is the ideal, what is plan A. Most of us are living plan D, E, and F. We're not living plan A. Incorporating to the extent that you can or that he would allow. My grandfather used to, much to the chagrin of my grandmother, he used to help, she sewed. And so he would cut patterns, much to her chagrin. But it's like sometimes having a child involved. It's not for the efficiency of the act, it's for the inclusion. And so, but the talking, being in proximity, even if he's not sharing the actual activity, it is the inclusion. I'm making this for this particular person, or this is this particular thing. Every one of us wants to be included in the life of our spouse. And I think, whether we say it or not, but like I guess my pat answer is, all of us are living plan C, D, E, F. Most of us are not living plan A. So, not to be accusatory at all, you just look at the ideal and try to work toward the ideal.